You just heard an excerpt from a new tune that I've been working on called Polymetricism. It's not done and it's not released yet, but it will be very soon. While I'm working on finishing it, I thought it would be a fun idea to show you some behind the scenes of what I did in the production of this track. This video is going to be the first in a series of videos where I break down different elements of polymetricism so you can see what went into creating a track of this nature. In this series, we're going to look at composition, mixing, mastering, inspiration, and how I process the sound of each instrument to get it to sit in the mix and sound interesting. As you would have probably seen in the title of this video, today we're going to look at the bass. So let's jump on over and see how I made the bass sound the way it does in this track. Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at how I achieved the bass sound in my tune Polymetricism. I did some fairly interesting things to get the bass sound here, some things that I've been working with for a while but haven't really put in a tune before, and some entirely new techniques as well. So let's jump in and take a look. To come up with the bass sound, I wanted to use an electric bass but still get a synth bass sound from that instrument. To achieve this, I'm running through a series of effects to create the sound. Originally, I created the sounds in Ableton digitally, but for the final product I did something a little bit different. So let's take a look at the original version of the bass sound and how I achieved it. So I've got the project file up here in Ableton. Let's take a look here at this track Ableton Bass, which is the original bass sound, and take a look at how I came up with the sound from start to finish. This is what it sounds like on its own. Let's take a listen to the sound without any effects or processing. This is what it sounds like. Now, first of all, the first thing I did was I pitched this whole thing down an octave, or 12 semitones, to get a deep bassy sound. You might not be able to hear this without headphones or good speakers, but this is what that original bass sound sounds like down an octave. Nice and low and thumpy, but it loses a lot of clarity and high end. Like this, it's pretty much just that low bass note with no extra timbre. So we have to do a little bit more to get it to where we want. The reason I've pitched it down an octave instead of just playing down an octave is because we do get that deep, thumpy, fundamental sound, which sounds like the good basis for a synth sound. Now, this is something that bass players have been doing for a while. It's a common technique to take an octave pedal like this one and turn the dry signal down, but then an octave below your signal up all the way to 100%. So all you're getting is that sub-octave. Now, that can be a really good effect to creating a synth sound, but it only goes part of the way to creating a fully fledged gritty synth sound. So let's see how we finish the process. So once we take that lower octave signal, the first thing I do is run it through Archetype Tim Henson and just through the boost to give it a little bit more punch. Nothing else is switched on, just to give it a little bit more punch as we go into the rest of the things going on in here. Now the next thing is this pedal effect. Now I've taken the bass guitar synthesizer preset and I think I've tweaked it a little bit, but basically it's a fuzz with a little bit of treble boost, a little bit of mid boost, a little bit of gain, and the output turned down. Now I've sub up so we get some low frequency coming through, which is what we want for a bass. And I've also got the dry wet pretty hard, and this is what that sounds like. That's very heavy and very fuzzy, which is close to what we want, but we want to now rein that back in because that's a little bit too intense. So the next thing I do is put that through a bass amp. Now that's starting to pull it back and give it a thumpier sound as if it's being played through an amplifier, but we can do a little bit more. So the next thing is a little bit of EQ to roll off some of the very high end, peak some of the interesting frequencies that are going on here, and make sure that bass is coming through nice and clear. And also roll off anything in the really low end that we don't want. That sounds like this. That cut to the high frequency, that low pass filter, is doing quite a bit to tame it. But the next thing to give it a real bit of interest is an auto wah, or an envelope filter. And to achieve that, I'm playing through the auto wah. You can see I've turned on the auto wah over here. The auto wah in Archetype Corey Wong from Neural DSP. I also have a little bit more EQ going on in here. And that is going to give it that wah kind of sound. Sounds like this. Now you can see we've taken off a lot of the grit, but we get a little filter sweep through the notes, and that really turns it into less of a fuzzy bass guitar, and now we're getting more of that synth bass sound. And then the last thing is this extra EQ to boost a little bit more of that high frequency, cut off the extra highs, and then make sure the lows are coming through. Now in the context of the full track, that sounds like this. Now this bass sound is pretty good, but it doesn't go all the way of getting the kind of sound that I wanted. What I was trying to do with this bass sound is replicate, using plugins and effects, a sound that I already create really well using my pedal board. So in the end, I didn't actually use this bass sound. I used it for a demo and to try out the sound without having to plug in any cables or anything. But for the final sound, I decided to plug in the pedal board, set it up, and record the bass through the pedal board. So that's what we're going to take a look at now. This track here, pedals bass, is what is used in the final track. Let's take a listen. You can hear a similar kind of sound. On its own, it sounds like this. Now, that to me is much better. It's a lot punchier and a lot grittier. So let's take a look at how I achieved this sound using my pedals. So, to play the bass line for this track, I'm using my Ibanez EBH with a low B string, and we're using that to get the low D. Now, on the pedal board, first in the chain, which you should be able to see up here, is my bass compressor, and this is just evening out the sound. Just making sure when I hit the strings extra hard, they don't clip, and when I'm playing a little bit too soft, it's going to bring that up as well. After that, I run into the bass distortion from MXR, and that's going to give us the grittiness that we were originally getting from that fuzz pedal in the original version. It's giving us a bit of dirt, and it's adding some high end to the bass sound. Now that high end is essential because when we add the auto wah or the envelope filter, we need to have a frequency to sweep through. So next I'm going to turn on my bass envelope filter, and that's going to give us that full synthy sound. So, using just these three pedals, I've turned my electric bass guitar into a synth bass. And that's what I used to get the bass sound all the way through this track, Polymetricism. Now, there's one last bass sound that we have to look at in this track, and that is the sound of the bass solo. This is the bass solo in context. And the sound on its own. To create the tone for this solo, I used a similar series of effects to the lower bass part with some slight alterations. First of all, I played it on my other 5 string with a high C string to be able to get the higher notes in this solo. Here's what that sounds like on its own. You can hear at the end there especially why the high C string on my other 5 string bass is really important, because we've got those quite high notes at the end of the solo. Now that sound is then running through a very similar pedal effect to the low bass, but this time just with a little bit less of the sound coming through. Here's what that sounds like. That's making it nice and fuzzy again. Then I'm running it into Archetype Tim Henson from Neural DSP, and that's doing a few things. First of all, it's giving us a boost and a little bit of compression. Then the Cherub amp is giving us a little bit of drive. The EQ is just giving us a little bit more of those high mids and cutting off some of the bass. Even though this is a bass solo, we don't want those low frequencies coming through because we're not using them in what we're playing. Just because it's a bass instrument doesn't mean it's playing in the bass register. And then finally, we're running through a chorus, blended just a little bit above 50% wet. The delay is turned off, and so is the reverb. This is what that all sounds like. It's giving us a bit more fuzz and a little bit more high end, which is going to be useful when we go over to the next effect. After that, we run into Archetype Corey Wong to give us an envelope filter and a bit of compression. Before, we used an auto wah, only this time we're using an envelope filter to get that wah wah sound. The reason we've made it so fuzzy and introduced so much high end with the Archetype Tim Henson and with this fuzz pedal here is because we need the high end to be able to filter out when we introduce the envelope filter with the Archetype Corey Wong. Let's take a listen. Now there's just a few other things to finish off this solo sound. The next is just a teensy bit of reverb to add some space, an EQ, which is just cutting out that very low end that we don't want, because some of these effects introduce a bit of low end, so we're cutting that out entirely with this EQ. Next, I've added this phaser to give just a little bit of movement. It's only blended in at 20%. And lastly, one final EQ to completely roll off those sub-frequencies and just turn down a little bit of that low end, because I don't want this bass solo interfering with some of those other lower elements in the piece, the other synthesizers, and the actual bass part, which is the main element holding down the low end. We want their solo to kind of soar over the top. Here's the complete tone for that solo. And the whole thing together in context. And that's how I made the bass sounds for Polymetricism. I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into bass sounds in this track, Polymetricism. If you like this video, I have lots of videos like it exploring music production and the behind the scenes of how I create music. So take a look at some of the videos linked below or on my channel. If you want to see more videos like this, especially more videos about this track Polymetricism, then definitely subscribe, because there'll be more of that in the future, as well as lots of other videos about music. If you like the video, leave a like, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.